afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to have so many people register to attend the architecture of Walter Netsch from Chicago Collections and our co-presenters, the Chicago Area Archivists. I'm Ellen Keith. I'm the Executive Director of CCC, and I'm joined by my colleagues from CAA, Gretchen Neidhart and Lindsay Olson. So thank you so much for co-sponsoring. Just a couple brief things. Our land acknowledgement. Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse Indigenous nations that reside here today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region as well as their ancestors. Explore Chicago Collections is our platform. Please search it. Please check out our latest events. And thank you to our supporters. This cannot be done without Mellon, DCASE, Illinois Arts Council, and all the rest. We so appreciate you. I am thrilled today to be joined by my colleagues at member institutions, Leanna Barcelona, the University Archivist at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Rebecca Kaufman, Curator of Religion and Community History at the Chicago History Museum, and Kevin Leonard, University Historian at Northwestern University. We're here on social media, so check us out. And then check out our colleagues at the Chicago Area Archivists for all the wonderful things they have going on. I'm going to dive into this, and we're going to have time for questions at the end. Before we start with the CHM stuff, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, we have such interest in this program. What is it about Netsch? Is he a polarizing figure? Do people love to hate him? Do people love him? Tell us what you think. I'm going to start with Rebecca.
That's what I have for having my slides first. It's a great question. I think the question of love to hate is definitely where I feel like we landed, at least in our preparation discussions. It's hard to find somebody who's completely neutral unless they don't know who he is, which is actually something we're talking about too, how Netsch is somebody who not enough people maybe understand the fullness of the work that he did and the influence that he had. And I think it'll be fun to dig into some of the reasons for that today as well. So I'm camp love to hate, I think, or hate to love.
Kevin, what do you think?
Well, I am biased. I carry a torch for Walter Netsch, and I keep a picture of him in my office, which is in a Netsch building. But yes, I guess polarizing would be a good word because I am familiar with so many people who take issue with the structures that he built, particularly here at Northwestern. I would say that probably don't understand the context of his work and are reacting out of ignorance. But yeah, it is polarizing because the views tend to run very strongly pro and con.
There's no sort of neutrality. Leanne,
Right.
what do you think? You're at a Netsch campus.
Yes. So I don't know if speaking from our campus's perspective, I don't know if Netsch himself is polarizing, but definitely when we're talking about brutalist architecture and what our campus looks like and how it functions for our students. I do have a slide later about some interesting Reddit posts that you can find to see what current and past students think about our campus buildings. And there's definitely a lot of people that love what Netsch built here. And then there's a lot of people that maybe aren't the biggest fans and are definitely in favor of some of the renovations that are happening on campus, which we'll talk about later. But certainly polarizing. And I do think from a student perspective here, there is a few people that are neutral, that certainly don't really care about what the buildings look like. But I don't know if all the students necessarily know who Netsch is if they're outside of our architecture arts program, but it's definitely a conversation piece.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you all. Okay, we're going to start by institution and some context for Netsch. And Rebecca, as our historian, is going to start us off.
All right. Hello, everybody. So as Ellen said, my name is Rebecca Kaufman. I'm the curator of religion and community history. So you might ask yourself, why am I talking about Walter Netsch if I'm talking about religion, and maybe he did some religious work, but what does that really mean about the architecture that we're talking about today? And so I wanted to share a little background into kind of the work that I do at the museum, as well as how that intersects with collections like the Walter Netsch collection, as we think about his biography. And I'll also say, I'll share a little bit about his biography, but I think really the goal of today is to think about what it means to be stewards of legacies and stewards of materials. So I'm not going to give you the Wikipedia page on Netsch's life today. That's not the version of the talk we're doing here. So it'll also move pretty quickly as we think about projects. So in my position and in my personal background, I have a background in architectural history, sustainability, adaptive reuse, and how communities think about space. And so for me, when I'm looking at the architecture collections at the Chicago History Museum, I'm really lucky to work with colleagues who understand architects as people, buildings as design, but also the connection to how the public cares about these things. And so, it's not just me in curatorial, it's folks in collections, certainly folks through our research center who are all stewarding this together. And we are thinking about how we create better awareness, not just of the materials, but again, how people are connecting to those materials. And so the slide that Ellen has pulled up for us is actually work that we are doing to continue to make access to the architecture materials better. And so that's part of an ongoing inventory that is, again, a collaboration, all those folks I just said. So this is an Airtable that you can search through and look through materials. I'm sure we will reminisce together on this more later, but not everything that you see is something that you might be able to access quite yet. But, baby steps and goals as we move forward. If you want to go to the next slide. So just to also say, we're a part of a network, right? So we have our things at CHM. But you can also find materials through our relationships like the CCC. If you want to go to the next slide, Ellen. So folks may know we have an architecture collection if you happen to be a researcher of Chicago's built environment, but I am both shocked and not shocked at how many people don't really realize the depth of our architecture collections and how long we've been collecting Chicago's built environment. And so built environment, of course, is a really broad phrase. And so the idea that space, land, buildings, how we all occupy, move, and think about them, I mean, that's Urban Studies 101, which as a Chicago history site is what we do. But specifically our architecture collections, I think, have been shadowed in part because of this lack of access and lack of awareness around kind of digital assets and things like that. And so I pull this quote often about kind of how early curatorial and research thought was for why we had these architecture collections. And Wim DeWitt, who was one of our early curators, said there was kind of this goal of collecting these materials to put the architect in context to his life. So we weren't going to just think about buildings in terms of design. We were going to think about this as a whole body of work, a whole biography, a part of a story, and understanding what that meant for both the architect as a person, but then how that filtered into his work throughout. And of course, that sounds like something a lot of contemporary architecture collections are doing, but in the 1970s, this seemed like a departure for folks. And so they were really invigorated by that. We're going to go to the next slide, Ellen. So in the work that we're doing now, and I've given talks on this, so I'll spare you a long diatribe today, but we are taking that approach of thinking about the whole lives of architects and really extending that into whole lives of communities and cities. And so we're reorienting the archive, not just about the buildings and the architect, but the communities who use these spaces. And so the inventory work that we do, the community outreach that we do, is re-establishing that connection, that narration, that relationship between not just buildings, but also communities. So I'm always happy to talk more about that if anyone wants to talk more. But for that, we're going to jump forward into what does that mean for Netsch today? So going back into what are the kinds of materials we have? If we say we wanted to collect this whole life version of Netsch, I think people are aware, obviously, of his work in particular as part of SOM. So if you're looking at Chicago architecture for even 5 minutes, probably on a Wikipedia page, you'll learn about the Second Chicago School of Architecture. So this is really the modernist movement that's responding to early 20th century, late 19th century architecture for big names like Burnham and Sullivan. And we're moving into this modernist moment where we have Mies van der Rohe coming to Chicago, establishing a vocabulary that's very influenced by the Bauhaus, things we see in Europe, steel, glass, boxes, all those good things. And so Netsch is a part of this moment, right? And he's not just a part of this moment. He's trying to think about what is his particular view into the moment that is going to be different and distinguish himself. And so, he's a Chicago boy. He was born in Chicago. He grew up on the South Side. His dad was a meatpacking executive. And they kind of, bootstrapped their way, if we want to look at it that way, into a position of power, into a position of privilege. And so when you read his own reflections on this upbringing, you can kind of see how it infuses both this identity of the city with this particular moment of privilege, especially through things like the Great Depression, entering World War II, and these moments of kind of anxiety, not just Chicago is having, but really the world, you know? And so what is his architectural development through these moments? And so it's not just the story of a person. Again, it's this story of these really big historical moments he's responding to. And so it's so interesting to me because when we talk about his work, I think we try to contextualize it in this modernist bubble. That in a way, when you're reading his story, like, much of this is a part of the processing of the world around him. Um, I wanted to start with something fun though, because not everyone thinks about architects as fun people. Like Netsch is a very serious sounding guy. When you look at his buildings, you see these big, imposing concrete structures. And at the end of the day, he's a guy. He's an artist. He's a designer. And so something that's really fun in our collections that in fact weren't even fully cataloged as I was looking through them are a series of doodles that we have. And so there's even a little clipping around why we doodle. Thank you for moving us forward, Ellen. So these are very serious minutes he's taking at SOM meetings with all the partners. And you see him working out his own little sketches and designs. He's working on his own little field theory moments. As we're also learning about, retirement accounts needing to be buttressed and how are we going to bring on more staff, all those good things. But you see these iterations as you're starting to understand this is a person who's just not just designing these big mass scale projects, but he's also a thinker, a creative mind, somebody who's, workshopping all of this together in his daily life. And perhaps as a coping mechanism, frankly, if you read through some of those relationships he had at SOM. I'm going to go forward, Ellen. So, Netsch is best known for this development of what he called field theory, and field theory is something that exists in psychological circles as well. I'm going to make my religion curator claim today, and it will be fun to see if people agree or disagree with me on this. But a lot of people talk about field theory as coming out of psychology and something that's very embedded in the scientific moment. Again, going back to maybe we could talk about the psychological concerns of the Cold War or some of these impetuses of the world around you and trying to find order through geometry. But when you actually take a step back, I find that Netsch's work is really closely aligned with sacred geometry. And he never says that articulation out loud. If we want to go forward again, Ellen, we can look at some more. He never says sacred geometry out loud. And I think that's really interesting for a lot of reasons. And again, I'll spare you all of my theories for today, but these are just some examples of how he's working with these forms, these geographical moments, or geometrical forms and creating relationship. And you can read a lot more about how he develops these. If we want to go forward one more, Ellen, just again, some of the sketches and the work that we have, and you can see how these iterate into different development. We'll go forward one more. And this is a chrysanthemum field, which is also very interesting. And then we'll go to one more just for the sake of time. In reading his biographical information and interviews with him again, where is field theory coming from? What are the interests he had? And I found this really interesting moment in his oral history interview with Betty Bloom, where he's talking about how he didn't necessarily come from field theory in I think he kind of uses the phrase of discovery in some ways. And I think it's interesting because then he'll also credit the water he was swimming in growing up in the South Side and the influences that he had in his life. And one of the things he points to is Barry Burns' apartment building with these Ian sculptures. And being in Chicago, thinking about the first Chicago School of Architecture, the water he's swimming in, that makes some sense, right? Looking to what's around him, Prairie School, Frank Lloyd Wright, and some of the reactions to that. Maybe that's something we might expect. If you want to go to the next, Ellen. But something else he starts to credit, and it's almost in like a retrospective sense, is the water he was swimming in religiously. And so his mom was a Christian Scientist. His dad also practiced Christian Science. And they went to a Christian Science church right here, which he ascribes as his first encounter with, let's call it, mosque architecture, because the interior was so influenced by kind of Middle Eastern style architectures, Islamic architectures, and he drops these bits and bobs throughout his life story of where he's realizing the subconscious association with the places he'd been. And in fact, he had designed a building in North Africa. And he says that when he was describing field theory to North Africans in Algeria, they said it was almost like he was reintroducing their own culture to them. And I think that's a really interesting way of an acknowledgement that kind of towards the end of his life, that he had been influenced by Orientalist themes, Islamic themes, sacred themes, and it wasn't really something he had pieced together, except for in these contexts of encounter with other communities as he's designing with them. And so, just my religion curator theory for the day. We can talk much more about it, but let's keep moving forward. So again, we know him for many things, especially here in Chicago. What probably puts him on the map most is this cadet chapel, and we'll just fly through these, Ellen, at this point if you want to just keep clicking, and then I'll pass the baton. But we have sketch work like this that's showing the iteration of how he's developing the geometry of the site and his influences for things in Europe, like Chartres. We look at, yeah, you can go ahead, Helen. Wells College, really famous example. I think in particular in the sketchwork, you see that sacred geometrical form that again, he's calling field theory. If we want to keep going, University of Houston, we can just keep going on. So again, sketches, iterations. So, these are a lot of seeing the mind behind how these finalized buildings. This sketch actually for Miami, if we want to go back just a quick slide, we see the geometric forms forming this pattern work that he would call the lattice, which again is a complicated procedure of trying to find these geometrical relationships. If we want to keep going. MIT, of which he was an alma mater. These are just some beautiful ink drawings that I wanted to show us. And then we're gonna keep going. I love seeing this kind of the programmatic analysis of how a library would work based on materials. So I thought we would all find this interesting today. Again, thinking about technology and how library use has changed, which I'm sure will come out as we talk about building use through time. And if we want to keep going, and again, just some sketches, different ways that he was working with anthropomorphic forms as he's thinking about community use of space. And then we can keep going, Ellen. Now we're getting back into Chicago a bit more. So University of Chicago, Northwestern University. This is actually for a dormitory that I'm not sure was ever constructed, but certainly very interesting to see his iteration of, again, of not just buildings, but also the pieces within the buildings, how all of it fit together as part of this geometrical relationship. We can keep going, Ellen. Just keep going. Yeah, I mean, he's really, really working with every piece of the puzzle is being thoughtfully introduced, again, with the thought of the use of how that space is, the color coding relating to these uses, the forms relating to, his prescribed understanding of how space would work. And then we'll go forward to the last slide, and then and I'm sorry, actually, one more back. Taking that sacred geometry idea of these floor plans is really interesting, or site plans. It's really interesting to see how the massing starts to work out. And I think that's something hopefully we can talk more about, where the intention of these really beautiful, intricate, delicate, almost seeming drawings, and then as they get massed into concrete and these other materials, there's a real juxtaposition between them that I find really interesting. And I think that will, again, come out in how communities perceive them. Intention versus reality. If we want to keep going again. And then, of course, UIC Circle Campus. And I would be remiss as a community historian to not talk about the devastating effects that this development had on communities, right? And Netsch is not unaware of this. And so, again, reading his own kind of reflections on this project, I think that's a whole other webinar we could talk about for a very long time and its impact on community. But what I do know is he was thinking about how students gather and how student life would be. And so if we want to go forward to one more, Ellen, and then that's my last slide, thinking about that drop of water and the reality of creating relationship and movement and, even if ill-conceived skyways of walking and relationship and connection, he really saw this as a way of putting that kind of sacred relationship or that geographical field theory to play in a way that he saw as a true system, a true ecosystem. And it's always interesting to think about, if he's using a term like ecosystem or system within the campus, how he did or did not see that relationship when it extended beyond the campus. And I think, again, as we hear from other folks, we'll get to reflect more on what that relationship, when you have kind of a view to one component of the site, what that holistic shift through time might bring us into today. So, all right, I've more than extended my time, so I will pass the baton.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. I just always, the amazing collections at CHM. Kevin, Northwestern, let me know, just tell me next and I will drive.
All right, so Walter Netsch exists in two forms at Northwestern: archivally in the collections of the archives in the library, although not to the degree that our peer institutions have Netsch material. We have a very nice, loosely, quickly done sketch of the main library building I'm in right now. But other than that, what we have from Walter Netsch are the owner's drawings of his buildings, and he did 7 buildings at Northwestern, and he also planned the construction and siting of buildings on Northwestern's Lakeville campus, which was a pivotal design and influential design in Northwestern's history. So we have photographs of Netsch buildings. We have the presentations. We have the business records, the correspondence that detail Netsch's relationship with the building or with Northwestern, but not necessarily the great architectural drawings that you'll see elsewhere. So when it comes to Northwestern, his first involvement was in designing Northwestern's Lakeville. Northwestern, by 1960, realized it was out of land, and to realize its academic ambitions, it needed to expand its campus. And it did so by buying from the state of Illinois a little over 150 acres of submerged land in Lake Michigan adjacent to the campus. And Walter came up with the plan to build out into the lake. The university approximately doubled its size beginning in 1962 by going out into the lake. Most of Netsch's Lakeville construction was done by 64. And then in 1968, an additional 10 acres were added to the south portion of the campus. This is a hinge moment in the university's history because the construction of the Netsch Lakeville allowed the university to build out its academic programs, research libraries, et cetera. Netsch also came up with the siting plan for buildings on that Lakeville, and that plan still pretty much guides the way Northwestern situates its buildings to this day. Something else about Netsch's influence, Northwestern prior to Netsch had oriented its structures to the Evanston street grid. Going out into the lake and the use of more contemporary modern construction techniques and materials allowed Northwestern to reorient its campus or the more modern buildings to take advantage of that lake siting. So we have much better lakefront views if that's your thing. Now you can go on, Ellen. Got some photographs of the early 1960s construction, seawall constructed out into the lake, and then land brought up by barge and dumped in there to fill it out. Keep going, please. And their photograph of the Lakeville largely as complete on the left. And then on the right, you have a photograph of the first building that was to go up on the Lakeville, designed by Netsch. It's the Lindheimer Astronomical Research Center. It opened in 1967. You can move on, please. A couple pictures of Lindheimer, and you get if you want to read the Netchian field theory into the rotated squares in there and the truss supports of the building, there you have it. Now, that particular building won an award from the Chicago chapter of the American Institute of Architects, but its long-term history was not a happy one. It's probably not a good idea to put an observatory, physical observatory, telescope observatory in Chicago, and that's what Northwestern did. So the building became a white elephant, and it became an expense. Its fulfillment of research ambitions could not be realized, and the building came down in 1995. Interestingly enough, you see the building listing there to the side. That's after the demolition program began. Netsch designed a very solid building, and whoever contracted to take that thing down, it was months in the offing. The building would not give up the ghost easily. So it was fun to watch. Next, please. Netsch's next building for Northwestern, which was realized in 1968, is the Rebecca Crown Center, which is an administrative structure that brought Northwestern's central administrative offices together in one location. On the left is a prosaic kind of grid pattern sketch, early sketch of Crown. And then on the right, you have a plan of the building as it actually was built and continues to exist. It's a conglomeration of three buildings joined together below grade with an interesting pattern. It is the gateway to Northwestern. If you were to find fault with it, and you can go on, Ellen. If you were to find fault with it, is the gateway to Northwestern, but it's built up at an angle. So when you approach Northwestern from the city of Evanston, you kind of have to look up as a supplicant to it. It's not necessarily a welcoming type of building. The photograph on the right shows a tree. That is a depressed area, a conversation pit that Northwestern built on the plaza at the Rebecca Crown Center. Netsch's principal buildings at Northwestern, Rebecca Crown Center and the University Library, feature large plazas exposed to the outdoors. We're talking about Netsch being polarizing. People love him, people dislike his work. The problem here is that Northwestern is located in Evanston, and in Evanston you have things called like October, November, December, January, February, and into March, and there's not a lot of opportunity for outdoor seating. You'd be ill-advised to sit out there during much of the academic year, and that part of the year when you might take advantage of the siting, June, July, August is when students aren't around. So the plazas have not been terribly successful as places where people can mingle. Go on, please. Interior space of one of the large rooms at the Rebecca Crown Center. So it's very austere design, and because of the austerity of Netsch's design in his buildings over the decades, the original look of and feel of the buildings has been altered to match the sensibilities of successive generations, so that space no longer looks like that. It's more highly decorated than it was in Netsch's plan. Okay, you can go on, Ellen. O.T. Hogan Biological Sciences Building dates to 1971. And talking about field theory, you can see from that design the rotation of geographic forms that would create an interior network of small laboratories. If you wish to disagree with Netsch's work, is that the progression of scientific investigation in the decades since its construction, that type of work has favored larger, more open spaces, collaborative type of research. So the interior has been something of a challenge because his design cut up the interior spaces. If you wouldn't mind going on. Okay, you can see three of Netsch's buildings on the left on Netsch's landfill campus. The Hogan building I just mentioned is in the foreground. To the left is the Francis Searle Communicative Disorders building, and in the top of the building is the Lindheimer Astronomical Research Center. Again, no longer exists. If you wouldn't mind moving on. There is the Francis Searle building, which is a work in Netsch's field theory of rotated spaces, but in three dimensions. I don't have a real good look at the inside, but I do have a few photographs, and you can see this is not just a two-dimensional on paper exercise, but something that you can experience as an individual moving through space. Go on to the next one. Yeah, there's a sense of what that building looks like on the interior. Now, I will say that building has been physically not heavily modified, but in terms of chromatic keys, directional signage, etc., it has been a challenge for people to navigate on the inside. So the interior is highly modified to help people get around that field theory interior space. Go on, please. But the Francis Searle building, also another work that Netsch did for Northwestern that received an AIA award. Okay, next, please. Regenstein Hall of Music exists at Northwestern, and you can see the Netchian forms there, the interlocking forms that he favored in that plan. Go on to the next, please, Alan. And there it is in reality. The building includes practice spaces for Northwestern's music school students and faculty, and also a performance space. The performance space is unusual for a concert type of venue because the audience going there is sitting above rather than if you go to the Symphony Hall or something, you tend to look up at the stage. So it's more or less being in an operating theater at a medical school because what you're doing there is watching students perform or watching faculty demonstrate techniques. So he used that model to do that. Now the Regenstein Hall, while it still exists and is very functional, admittedly has been hidden and deliberately so behind a new building at Northwestern. So it is not as prominently seen as a feature of the Northwestern landscape. Okay, go on, please. The Seeley Mudd Science Library was a 1976 Walter Netsch building, pretty spare rectilinear building, but some feel for his rotated squares field theory work on the interior. That building exists in name, but it is so extensively modified that it is no longer Netchian. If you wouldn't mind moving on from there, interior space of the Seeley Mudd. Okay, we can go on from there. The principal building for which Netsch is known at Northwestern is the University Library, from which I am speaking. And here is a look, an early design proposal by Netsch. The building is vastly different from that early sketch. If you go on, Netsch had a program of requirements that were developed at Northwestern with a faculty committee. The leading figure of the faculty committee was a historian named Clarence Versteeg. Clarence Versteeg, during World War II, flew on a bomber in the Pacific Theater of Operations. And when he was involved in as a faculty member in architectural planning, he happened to visit the Air Force Academy and the Air Force Academy Chapel. And the war was a pivotal event in Professor Versteeg's life, and he went in there as a former airman and supposedly said, "My God, get us this person." So heavily influenced by Netsch's work at the Air Force Academy, but the Northwestern Library he built doesn't look anything like the Air Force Academy, particularly its chapel. Program of requirements anticipating a couple million volumes, and then very significant percentages of students and faculty using the library, engaging in books in a new way at Northwestern. The previous library had been not a browsing library. If you wanted a book, you'd have to request it. It would be delivered to you. The faculty planning committee and Netsch wanted a building where people could interact with the books and browse the books. They created a three-tower structure because the mass of the building was so great. Breaking it up into towers alleviated the problem of having a hulking building over the campus. And then creating towers with a very interesting radial stack arrangement that has been the bane of some employees of the building. But what the radial stack arrangement did for users of the building was allow seating within between the bookshelves, the book stacks that allowed people quiet study areas mingled in with the books itself. In between each of those book stacks at the narrow point of the triangle formed, you would have one bentwood carrel. As you moved away to where the book stacks diverge, you'd have room for two. So Northwestern, when that building went up, could accommodate at any one time 40% of its undergraduate enrollment and 80% of its graduate enrollment and faculty in social studies and humanities. So it was a vastly different experience for Northwestern patrons and faculty. All right, we can move on from there. And then some buildings. Now, I told you earlier, I am a big fan of Walter Netsch, and I've been here for over 50 years, and I have never tired of seeing that building because the exterior, the striations and the limestone and the concrete patterning and whatnot, the way it holds shadows and the way the shadows creep across the building during times of the day or periods of certain weather is very lively. If you wouldn't mind going on. Okay, there's another one. So that's pretty much it for me. But again, Netsch left an indelible mark on this campus, doing the lake fill and the 7 buildings. Unfortunately, not all those buildings will remain the way he did them, but he's definitely left his mark here.
Thank you, Kevin. Oh my
Thank
God.
you.
Those are just amazing photos. And so now we're going to go to Leanna Barcelona, who is at an all Netsch campus. So Leanna.
Yes, and actually, I'm going to start off not necessarily about our holdings, but just to say that it's not an all Netsch campus, which I think is something that people don't always think about, and it's one of the unique challenges and opportunities here at UIC, in that we are sort of a split campus. So when we talk about the Netsch campus, we're mostly talking about what was formerly the University of Illinois Chicago Circle campus. And now we sort of just say East Campus, and that's our campus that primarily serves our undergraduate population, as well as some of our graduate and postdocs in certain disciplines, while our West Campus is health science focused. There is one sort of Netsch-ish building on our West Campus, and that is our Student Center West. And both of the student centers at UIC, our West Campus and East Campus student centers, were designed by architects that worked under Walter Netsch. So there is a little bit of brutalism over on the West Campus, but most of those buildings have been around for a really long time. But when we're talking about the brutalist architecture and Netsch's work here at UIC, this was just a slide that I had mentioned earlier. As I said, you can find a lot on Reddit about how people feel on our campus. This was from 4 years ago, which is kind of an interesting time. Would have been 2022-ish, coming right out of the pandemic, sort of. So a lot of the students that were here maybe started during the pandemic, weren't on campus, but you can see maybe overwhelmingly people weren't a fan of the architecture on campus, and also a lot of people that are indifferent. I think that's probably a product of what our institution exists for, and then a small portion of people that love it. So that's just a little bit about the opinion. But next slide, Ellen. We do hold some of Walter Netsch's papers here at UIC. My colleagues in the manuscript side of the department handle this collection. It includes about 70 linear feet, and his work with some, as well as some independent work and personal materials, likely a lot of duplicate materials of things that you might find at other archives in the city, but those are something that we have here. In addition to that, when we're talking about Walter Netsch at UIC, it's not just about the buildings, and Rebecca kind of touched on this, but Netsch was sort of responsible for the campus plan over here on East Campus and deciding where the buildings were going to be. UIC is very unique in the sense of when it was built. We're talking about kind of recent, even though it was well over 50 years. But this idea that there was space to decide how a campus would be laid out, and the idea of a drop in the pond, with the center of campus initially having the Circle Forum and the amphitheater, which was all concrete and granite, and then surrounded by the lecture halls where the students would be learning. And then further out, the buildings where offices for faculty and administration were, as well as the library, and later on the student center. There weren't dorms initially, because, as many people know, UIC was kind of marketed as and continues to be a commuter school. So the dorms came later, and it was really just about the learning experience. So we're talking about campus planning. Not everything that we have related to Netsch is going to be in a folder or a file name titled Walter Netsch. So you're looking at things like our Office of the Chancellor records to see how they were deciding to lay out campus, or all of the correspondence and business documents that were involved in that process. If you could go to the next slide, Ellen. this is an interesting resource that we have. I would say it's our holdings. We have a digital exhibit that's called the Historic Netsch Campus Walking Tour. It in itself is something that we've become a steward of. It was created, I want to say at least 20 years ago, by the University Historian's Office, which no longer exists. They had it in various different formats online, and as time has gone on, it's been migrated and migrated again, and it is now in our scalar environment, soon to probably be migrated again to become more accessible. But within this exhibit, it kind of goes more into all of the buildings on campus. I invite people to check out the link. I'm not going to go through all of the different campus buildings and whatnot, but coming at this from an archivist perspective, this has been an interesting thing to steward, because a lot of the original photographs obviously were scanned 20 years ago, and they weren't scanned from things necessarily held in the university archives. They were actually things that office had. And so getting questions for high resolution copies of things in this exhibit always proves to be an interesting treasure hunt to try to see where that stuff ended up in any of the boxes that we received when the University Historian's Office closed. But this is something that I know a lot of people still enjoy taking a look at, especially the folks that really do love the campus architecture, and it really shows what campus initially looked like, because it has changed a lot since then. And then the other two things that I just mentioned about the holdings here at UIC is that given our institutional context, not all architectural records, drawings, documents are in the university archives. We follow retention schedules set out by the state as a public institution. And so our planning, sustainability, and project management office is actually the unit that maintains most of the drawings for our campus buildings, which would include a lot of Netsch's work. And a lot of that is not actually something that can be accessed by the public, because they're buildings that currently exist. So there's a policy of students, especially students in our architecture program. And I recently read that the policy says employees in good standing are allowed to look at these drawings, but the public is not. They can see maybe some of the plans that just include the building size and things like that in name, but as far as more of the in-depth drawings that really are showing where everything is, that's not something that everybody can see. So that's an important note. And then obviously, you know, when you're talking about an architect that worked with a firm, there's a lot of stuff that exists outside of our institution with SOM. So this will come up later in a question, but lots of different places that you can find things. Obviously, even in Rebecca's slides, you can see there's information and records related to UIC being built elsewhere. So that's where CCC and Explore really comes in to help connect all of the holdings that we have.
Leanna, I'll ask, the moving on to what you do have. Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, so I'm saying that what we do have is the Walter Netsch papers, as well as some of those things in the office of the chancellor and several different photographic collections and things like that. Some of my other slides are for the other questions, but this is just a picture of one of the most infamous buildings on campus, the behavioral sciences building. You can kind of see this aerial shot of what it looks like, similar to some of the stuff we saw at Northwestern too, as well as a side view of it.
Apologies, I got ahead of myself. So yes, moving on. So we've talked about your the holdings that each of you have. So my question for Leanna and for Kevin, what are you seeing on your campuses with regard to your buildings, the Netsch buildings? And how they're adapting to the 21st century.
Well, I'll start. One Netsch building at Northwestern has been completely obliterated. A second one obliterated, but for its name. A third building has been hidden because perhaps its stylistic presentation has fallen out of favor. So there's been much change. Again, the work can be polarizing, but I ask you to recall that the buildings that we have here and elsewhere from Netsch's career, they're at least 50 years old, and there are developments that have occurred in the decades post-construction, post-planning that Netsch couldn't have anticipated. So I'm in a library. Imagine, the digital resources. Behind me is a wall. On the other side of that wall is a large space, several thousand square feet, that had been devoted to the card catalog. Well, the card catalog's gone now. So there are lots of interior changes that have been required for the Netsch buildings at Northwestern, but not through Netsch's fault, unless you fault field theory and the way it divided space, that it becomes less accommodating to future reuse.
Could you go to the next slide? So this is sort of an example of how things have changed. This is obviously the construction of campus back in the 60s, where we're seeing the elevated walkways that existed on campus, and the kind of known as the Great Court, as well as the Circle Forum with the amphitheater in the center. And that all has changed. I do have some photos on the next slide about the walkways. They were probably maybe one of the first changes. So you're seeing them being used on the left side. In the middle, you can see this aerial shot. They were kind of thought to be pedestrian walkways. There were more streets at the time that had through access. And so the thought was that students would enter buildings on the second floor and they wouldn't need to cross streets, and it would be faster. But over 30 years time, and with our brutal Chicago winters, these turned out maybe not to be something that were the best idea, and due to maintenance issues and things, these came down in, I want to say, 1993. We do have here in the archives pieces of these. I have one in my office. So we've got lots of slabs of granite from the walkways here in the archives. So that was probably the first change. But on the last slide, there was a iteration in between the two photos. Ellen, if you wouldn't mind going back one slide, where there was just sort of, once the walkways came down and we were all back to the first level of ground floor of the campus, there was just concrete. Then here where you're seeing green space, and then in the last 4 years, they removed a lot of that concrete and created a grass space. And additionally, a lot of more green space has been added throughout the campus as well. As the campus has grown, the initial thought that the lecture halls would be where learning happened sort of needed to be expanded. And so some of the buildings where there are offices are also where there are classes. Those are the ones that are seeing kind of the first renovations. We do have 2 buildings where those like Fortress Illini design windows have been removed, and they're mostly glass. And that is currently happening with some other buildings. And a lot of that kind of comes down to also some accessibility needs on the inside. A lot of the buildings didn't have elevators that went to every floor. I'll be interested to see what campus ends up doing with the behavioral sciences building in the future to make it a little bit more accessible. It is sort of a labyrinth of a building. I know our Disability Cultural Center is housed in there, and it's certainly a challenge to negotiate moving around in that building. So definitely seeing lots of sort of changes. I think that there's a mixed thoughts on whether or not the new renovations have stayed true to some of the initial design or if they're too modern, especially when we're talking about glass windows. But some of it is just a need to make campus more accessible.
If I may add, there's a to me there's a purity to a Netsch building, to an unadulterated Netsch building. Uh, they are of an age where they require changes and modifications and repairs, but they're not old enough yet to have fallen into a canon where people can appreciate them in terms of architectural history. So that they're kind of, to me, a little bit threatened right now. But I think those Netsch buildings that will survive a generation or so are likely to be seen as an important part in American architectural history, and I think he'll be better appreciated at that point.
Good point. We're coming up on 10 minutes before the close of the program. I've got a couple more questions for my panelists, but we did want to leave time for Q&A. So I would encourage anyone to put in a question in Q&A for Kevin, Rebecca, and Leanna. In the meantime, I will ask, we had just had such interest in this program. And I feel like Chicago is just an architecture city. I mean, we build them up, we take them down. I'm thinking of poor Richard Nickel. But I'll ask our panelists, why is there such intensity around architecture in Chicago? If you have any thoughts on that.
Well, sure. Of course, the construction techniques that the rapid construction that was made necessary after the Chicago fire. You have the tragedy of the Iroquois Theater fire and the implementation of code relating to building. And certainly the great architects of the late 19th century, Burnham and Sullivan, and then the Prairie architects. It has been influential nationally and internationally. And Chicago's architecture, unlike its people or its manufacturing or its business, can't pack up and move to the Sun Belt. So there's an installed base here that's not going away, and it has become as you know, it's something for tourists to come in. One of the most popular attractions of the city for visitors from out of town is to take the architectural boat ride, and then visit other sites through the organizations that support more intensive looks at the city's buildings. So it's in a way an export project, but one that physically remains here.
I'm actually going to cut off Rebecca and Leanna before they can answer because we have some Q&As. So I will get to those. Sarah Pritchard, library dean emeritus at Northwestern, says regarding the landfill, Northwestern alums of that era still talk about hearing the trucks rumble all night, bringing dirt down for the fill. Oh, I can imagine. I've got a question. Is there any kind of Netsch biography in process?
I'll deeply say I'm inspired now with the level of research we've been doing with these materials. And I'll also say, he had intention of writing his own, and I'll kind of answer the second question about the field theory. He had an intention of writing his own that I don't think is ever completed in his lifetime. So there was a book in 2008, that was largely built on his work. And so that is kind of part biography, part commentary. But I think there's a lot more to do with that. And, maybe just something to say about field theory in general and something he acknowledged for himself. These are schools of thought, and this was such a complicated school of thought. It was very hard to apprentice other people, and it seemed like he had a very tight fist around who he thought actually understood what field theory was as he saw it. And so that's probably another part of the apprenticeship lineage side of this, architectural offices and who they choose to empower to carry the torch after them. SOM wasn't going to do it. So he had to think about his own legacy in that way. And I do think towards the end of his life, he recognized that.
No one mentioned the Regenstein, certainly, which of course, yes, one of major works. Any comments on the Regenstein?
I didn't because we were focused on holdings. We certainly have photographs, but we have photographs of so much of the built environment. We'd be here for a very long time. It also isn't really considered field theory in the way his other buildings were. So I think for me, I spent a little time thinking of it. But I was actually using the Regenstein yesterday and yeah, a fortress of its own. I'll say that much. I don't know if you, Kevin and Leanna, have thoughts compared to your own libraries.
I mean, it's amazing to see the similarities between the Regenstein Library and Northwestern's University Library. The exterior, the Regenstein is presented as a more rectilinear type of structure, but it's obvious when you look at those two buildings in Hyde Park and at Evanston that you're dealing with the work of the one and the same individual. They're very, very similar in the exterior detailing, just not in the arrangement of the space.
Good point. Oh, an excellent comment here from Lynn Becker. Just to note, the new book, Fire and Clay, by Will Quam, Brick of Chicago, has a nice discussion of Netsch's use of brick at the UIC campus. Excellent to know. I am looking forward to reading that. I've got a comment. So far, all these buildings, other than the chapel, sound like a disaster for institutions functionally, but also just in human scale and comfort. Well, Kevin looks very comfortable at his library.
Yeah, I'm very happy in my niche space. But sure, the buildings, and you can say it about so many architects or architects who have a strong sense of style or Frank Lloyd Wright. You want to live in a Frank Lloyd Wright building. I mean, you're going to be working on the roof all the time, but they are important in terms of design.
Yeah, and I'll also say, I mean, I have a preservation background, so I have a huge diatribe also on concrete as a material and what it takes to keep concrete moving, embodied carbon of concrete, how we should be thinking about the long arc of all these buildings through that lens. But the disaster for communities part, I think, I only touched on it really briefly, but you can see the theory being so beautiful in his head. And then when the massing starts to happen, there's something in the translation from the 2D to the 3D that I'm going to again make my religion curator comment of the day, but it's like the sacred geometry thought about inspiring awe. I don't know that he was thinking about inspiring awe when he was translating this into the 3D. He's thinking about a lot of other things, and so that's a really interesting distinction between I think his intent and where community saw it. Um,
That's a really good point, Rebecca. Those drawings and the doodles, everything is just has such life in it. Um, I've got a couple comments. Nathaniel Parks at Art Institute notes that, Netsch fans wants Netsch fans and researchers to know that Art Institute has about 80 linear feet of Netsch materials. And Nathaniel has shared the URL with us. I'm so sorry. Our chat is disabled in webinar, so I can't share it out to people, but I think hopefully people can find it, but that's excellent to know. We've got another comment. A UIC professor has made a virtual recreation of the UIC Netsch campus with the walkways. Netsch's Rubloff Auditorium at AIC and SAIC 280 building are both threatened. Is there any scholarly work on them?
I have read of them. Do I think there's dedicated studies? I need to look into that. It's a good question though, because they are under threat. So thank you for bringing attention to that.
Another good question. He had an incredible art collection of contemporary artists. Can anyone comment on he related to his own time and fellow artists?
I can hop in real briefly to just say, his home, of course, was designed with their art collection in mind. And so there's definitely a lot of conversation between how modernism writ large was being infused in the commentary of all of this and how he thought of his buildings. That is like a talk for another time, unfortunately, with what we have left, but definitely.
Yeah,
We
Walter and Don were major collectors, and they donated their works to some of their patrons. So there's a big Netsch donation painting behind me. But he, at least late in life, was most proud of the building he did for Miami University of Ohio, their art building, and much of their personal collection ended up with Miami, expression of their gratitude to the institution for engaging with the Netsch, with Walter.
We'll go a little over to take our last two questions. Having worked with him in the mid-70s, I find some harmony with Goff in the interest of having many levels. This is a time when accessibility was not the emphasis of architecture. Any comments on that similarity?
Like, I don't want to get myself in too much trouble today, but I will say the personality component I definitely see. And, again, I'm not going to try to create false parallels. I'll just say from studying Netsch's own thoughts around his work, I think he felt very misunderstood by everyone who used his buildings. And it seemed very much like he just thought someday they'll snap into seeing why this is the exact way this space has to be, and they're just not seeing it yet. And that's a kind of bold assumption that I don't know will ever rectify itself fully. So there is some yeah, interesting cult of personality stuff, I think.
With regard to accessibility, Walter, of course, designed the home in which he and his wife Dawn lived in Old Town neighborhood of Chicago. And late in his life, he was disabled because of illness. And it's sad to think of him getting around in his own home because it wasn't designed for what happened later.
Okay, I lied. I'm going to take two more questions. If you're hanging on, that means you love Netsch, so we're happy to have you. I think the shots of UIC in the movie Candyman as being the best look at his architecture. Are there any other good examples in film or TV? Good question. I do not know.
I guess Candyman is what comes to mind when I was thinking about film, but what I will say is there are some really fantastic Sun Times photos, which I know are journalism, but it's really showing how students are responding to the spaces as they were in the late 60s and 70s. And they're, really dramatic shots that could come like they're film stills. So I would definitely look at those for some of that kind of era.
Definitely. Oh, here's a good point. Apple TV Dark Matter has some interior shots of the Regenstein. Good to know. Thank you.
I was
And
also going to say that it's not a movie that I've seen, so I can't speak to it, but Stranger Than Fiction, I believe, has some campus shots from UIC. I don't think it's as maybe well known as Candyman is for our campus, but that's another movie.
that is good to know. Thanks, Leanna. The last comment, and then we'll get to the last question. Hedrick Blessing images made for SOM are beautiful. Absolutely. Hedrick Blessing photos are just amazing. And finally, thank you from Elizabeth Blasius, an architectural historian. Do any of you see a generational gap related to the likability or unlikability of Netsch or brutalism broadly? That's an excellent question. It's great to end on.
I'll answer first. I definitely see this on campus, and I think a lot of like nostalgia has something to do with that. And so we've got a lot of alum that were here prior to the 1990s who certainly have fond memories of their time here on campus, and that sometimes lends itself to a likability of the brutalist architecture. And you often hear that they miss the walkways. And our current students maybe one don't know that they used to exist, but I would say sometimes once they find out that they existed, that they wish they were still here, and in which case that's not so much of a gap. But I think the nostalgia aspect is certainly at play when we're thinking about generational gaps.
There's a legend that's passed around to young students when they arrive at Northwestern, and has been passed around for decades. And it's been disproven, but it's hard to eradicate this legend. It is that the architect of the library, and they won't know the person's name, forgot to calculate in the weight of the books, and the library is slowly sinking. Now, much of the Netsch Library at Northwestern is built on fill, so you can say something like that, but it is not true. It's a story that that young people use as it's a thumb in the eye of authority and older people and whatnot, but not true. But it is persistent, and it just continues.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, SOM is known for some engineering, so I hope not for your sake. The generational question, I think also, and thanks Elizabeth for your question. The 50-year rule guideline in historic preservation has always been asserted and a problem. But part of it is you need the march of time to really appreciate what you have, right? So things being dismantled in the 90s makes it really hard because it wasn't in that year where preservationists were thinking about it. And so I think we do look back with a different lens. And I definitely think going back to the material embodiment, we're thinking a lot more about buildings needing to be reused. We're thinking a lot more about I won't have a nostalgia the same way somebody from the 60s does, but I'll have an appreciation for the longer arc of architectural development and modernism's role in that. And, even what capital M modernism actually is, it's a lot of things we haven't looked at. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of gaps that we can be talking about.
Exactly. I will share our last two comments. Lynn Becker says, fantastic session. Thanks. You said it perfectly, Lynn. Yes. And Anzald said, Kevin, I've heard that legend about every library I've ever worked in, that it is sinking due to the weight of the books being left out of the architectural planning. Yes, I worked at Johns Hopkins University several years ago, and they always said the library was sinking. So I agree, Anne. Okay, we went over, but if you stayed, it's because you were so interested. Oh, awesome program. Thanks so much to everyone involved, from Elizabeth Blasius. My thanks. I'm going to stop sharing and share our wonderful panelists with you. This program is recorded, so after it's over, you will get a link to the recording. There were so many wonderful images that I made a PDF of the slideshow, and that should be able to be embedded into the YouTube site. Thank you so much, Leanna Barcelona, Rebecca Kaufman, Kevin Leonard, my co-presenters, Gretchen and Lindsay. We could have gone on and on about Netsch. So I don't know, there may be a part two. We don't know. But thank you all so much. Thank you for spending your Friday lunch with us. Have a wonderful day. Bye.